All right. I think we can get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. This is something we're doing pretty regularly now. So this will be, I think, our sixth Empire Builders webinar series. So for those of you who are joining for the first time, welcome. And for everybody who's coming back and has attended some of our past ones, thanks for continuing to listen in and join us. It's very much appreciated. Before we get started, I wanted to go over, for anybody who's new, just a quick summary of ApplePie, who we are, what we do, and a little bit about us. So for those who are not familiar with ApplePie, we are solely focused on franchise lending. So over the last 10 years, we have secured over $3 billion of loans across more than 200 brands. So we work with many different concepts and industries in the franchising space. That includes first-time operators all the way up to people who have 25 units and beyond. So no matter where you fall on that spectrum, our goal is to understand your specific financing needs, help you navigate the current lending environment, and just try to find the best option for you and your specific project at the time. The way that we do that is through a few different financing paths. One is through our conventional ApplePie Core Loan. That is our direct loan product. It's designed to help you grow faster and smarter. We also have we have plenty of long-term relationships with a wide network of SBA lenders, so we can certainly go down that path if that's what makes the most sense for your project. And then we also have an equipment finance division. So that can help with things like equipment-only loans, remodels, smaller purchase loans, etc. All right. Now that you are all up to speed on ApplePie, I'll introduce myself. I'm Samantha Holt. I'm the Director of Sales at ApplePie Capital. I've been here about 8 years now, since 2017. I manage our team of 9 relationship managers and a few other things. And every so often, I get to do things like this and talk to all of the experts in this industry. So today, we have sort of a different type of panelist on. Normally, we talk to multi-unit franchisees, and we've done that over the last 5 sort of episodes, but we're switching it up a little today, and we're really excited to have our panelist, Yvonne Holden. Yvonne, do you want to introduce yourself and give a little bit of information on your background?
Yes, so I have been working in franchise law for it'll be 10 years in April. I have my own firm. I started that in January 2023. It's based out of Mount Laurel, New Jersey. However, franchise law is federal law, so I have clients all around the country, not just in New Jersey. All the aspects of franchise law, what I enjoy the most are the commercial leases. So you're going to hear a lot about commercial leases today. You're going to hear a little bit about, franchise review and some other topics, but leases is what I really want to talk about with everyone since it's what I enjoy most.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, so yeah, I mean, jumping right in, obviously, we've touched on leases before in some of these conversations, but there's just so much to work through aside from just the monthly rent. So one of the things that nobody wants is surprises when it comes to signing a lease and things that can happen sort of down the road that you might not have anticipated. So I'm curious, what do you see that are some common surprises that people might not think to look for in a lease that, if not negotiated or made clear at the time it's executed, can happen sometimes years down the road?
Okay, so one of the first items is what are you, the tenant, responsible to repair or replace? That can be a really big one. And you need an attorney to go through the lease and one, make sure that all the landlord's work items in the LOI, a lot of times they're in an exhibit in the back of the LOI, that those items are included in your lease. If not, you could be delivered, given the keys to the premises. You think that the landlord's work is all done, what you expected them to do, and maybe there was something that didn't get into your lease that the landlord didn't do, and you ask the landlord, please, complete that. And they say, well, it's not in the lease. I'm not responsible to complete it. Then suddenly it's your cost and your responsibility to make sure that gets done in your build out. Something else to look for is just what is the landlord saying you're responsible for, like when it comes to, for example, utilities. A lot of leases will say that the tenant is responsible for the exclusive sewer line. So the sewer line that's your sewer line, but up outside the premises out to the free flow. And that might be fine. The main sewer line or the free flow may be just right outside your wall. Okay. But what if it's not? What if it's all the way through the parking lot and suddenly you're spending tens of thousands of dollars to repair a sewer line? And I've seen in the past where we've questioned, the landlord's so gung ho about you repairing and maintaining that sewer line, then we question, well, is it in good condition? So then I've had clients actually send a camera through before they sign the lease. And they found that maybe, that there's something blocking the sewer line's caved in, which is a very expensive fix. So you want to make sure that language in your lease says that you're only responsible for that sewer line if it's really close to the premises and a cheap fix for you. If it's way out in the parking lot, then you just want to make sure that the landlord is responsible for that.
Mhm.
Another surprise that I've seen in the last few years, I've had clients come back to me, their lease has been signed, it's been a few years, and they come back and say, I got a really, really big CAM bill and I don't understand. You need to be aware, your lease is going to say what your rent should be starting at. So you're going to have base rent and a lot of times the triple net. And there's 3 items to the triple net, which is also known as additional rent. There is the common area expenses. There's the real estate taxes and landlord's insurance. So common area expenses, are you getting billed for that every month? If your lease said that you're supposed to, and you're not getting a bill for rent that's as high as you thought it would be, don't think that you're getting off scot-free and that this is a wonderful opportunity. Because it's not. A year or 2 later, you're going to find out that the landlord is billing you annually instead of billing you monthly for the CAM, and that you owe a really, really big bill. Okay. And you're not expecting that. So reach out to the landlord if your rent number doesn't look like what it's supposed to look like, or you can reach out to your attorney. Somebody like me is happy to talk with the landlord and see, okay, what's going on. And I do want to talk a little bit more about CAM. So if you get into your lease that there is a cap on your controllable CAM, then you're likely to understand what that bill is going to be and what the reconciliation for the CAM is going to be at the end of the year. So the way CAM is billed is the landlord estimates what it's going to cost for you. They look at past years and what's been charged for that space. And they say, here's what I think it's going to cost you for the year. Then they divide it up by 12 and you pay 1/12 every month. But at the end of the landlord's fiscal year, they're going to do a reconciliation. And when they do that reconciliation, their estimate may have been too low or too high. If their estimate was too low, you're going to owe them the difference and you're going to get a bill for that. If the estimate was too high, you're going to get a credit. Okay. You want to make sure that the lease says that the landlord's going to reconcile every year. So you do get that reconciliation statement and you get the credit or you pay that bill. And usually you want to put a deadline on there because there's some landlords out there that will just not reconcile for years and then give you a big bill. So make sure you're getting billed for it every month. Make sure that there's a reconciliation every year. Okay.
I have a question on that.
Sure.
Is there any, with the reconciliation, obviously that can be in your favor, but are there any sort of conditions you can put on in the adverse where they happen to reconcile and let's say there's a large discrepancy? Like, is there anything that can be put in there to protect people from like getting a surprise $10,000 bill when they reconcile, right? Like, is that common or not really?
Sometimes there can be a surprise. So one thing I always add is that you have 30 days to pay that bill to the landlord. That gives you some more time because some leases, the landlords will try to get it within 10 days. And
Got
then you
it.
have to scrape up that money within 10 days.
Got it.
The other way that, you can you're aware of what the estimate is for that first year, that first lease year, what that estimate is for CAM. If you
Mhm.
get a huge bill and what the actual CAM cost is, it is so much more than that estimate, then you should be asking questions. You have the right to do an audit in the lease typically, find
Mhm.
out why it's so much more. And if it doesn't make sense, then some people sue the landlord and say, you misrepresented what CAM was going to be to me to kind of hook me into this lease.
Right. Okay. And then will they, there's actually a question, was sort of like a question and a comment. Will some landlords, if it is large, spread it out over a period of time? Like, is that a reasonable ask for if it is a
I
surprise or?
I've only seen that with the credit. So, you're supposed to
Okay.
get a credit back if the estimate was too high. And I've
Ah,
seen landlords try to divide up the credit so they're only giving you like a tenth for 10 months, which is something else. You can put language in the lease to try to avoid that. I've
oh,
never seen a landlord say, okay, I'll divide it up for you. But some landlords are really willing to work with you, especially if
got
you go back and get your attorney to write a letter or talk with them.
yeah,
So I think it could happen.
got it. Thank you.
So I started to talk about it and then I kind of went on a tangent, the cap on controllable cam. So you're probably asking, okay, what's controllable cam? Two types of cam, controllable, not controllable. And it's really the definition is what's in the landlord's control. So we define it by saying what's not in the landlord's control. So ice and snow removal, landlord insurance, taxes, like cost of security for the shopping center, all those things aren't considered controllable, so there's no cap on those. Okay.
Makes
But
sense.
pretty much everything else, and your lease will say what's controllable and what's not, but pretty much everything else is controllable, and you want to try to get a cap on there. Okay. So the cap means that if common area expenses, the actual costs, go up beyond a certain percentage for the next year, that you only have to pay up to the cap. So like 5%. So if they go up more than 5% of what you paid the first year, in the second year, you only pay 5% more. So that really helps you not have any surprises when it comes to CAM costs because the landlord can only raise CAM so much.
Got it.
Another term that we like to get into the lease with our controllable CAM is that it's non-cumulative, which means, let's say it doesn't go up 5% and there's unused percentages. Can landlord take those unused percentages and use them in a future year? They could take a whole lot of different percentages. Let's say year 9, take it from all the previous years and add them all together, and suddenly you have a bill you did not expect. So
Mm,
non-cumulative means they can't do that.
got it.
Cumulative means they can do that. Okay, so we want non-cumulative when we sign a lease.
Interesting.
Okay, CAM cap, I know I mentioned 5%. The norm is, I'd say 5 to 7% is kind of the norm for a controllable CAM cap. If you get lower, fantastic. I have seen as low as 2 and 3. I've seen as high as 12. But that's what you should be trying to get, somewhere around 5 to 7.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Any other surprises or things you look for early on that people might not know what they mean or they might be not be looking for that for those?
Yes, another big one is the subordination non-disturbance agreement. For short, we call it the SNDA. And that is an agreement between you and the landlord's mortgage company. So most people don't know this, but if the landlord has a mortgage on the shopping center and the mortgage company forecloses on the landlord, the mortgage company can choose to terminate your lease, or by law in some jurisdictions, your lease will automatically terminate. And if that happens, you've pretty much lost your business. It's really devastating.
Yeah.
So what you want to do is in the lease, put the wording that the landlord has to go get you an SNDA. Sometimes landlords will complain if it's a smaller franchisee. They'll say, well, our mortgage company does not give SNDAs to someone so small. Or they'll say, there's probably a really big fee. You really don't want us to do this. And you just keep pushing. You
Mm,
say, we really need this. Can you at least try to make commercially reasonable efforts to get it? Okay.
yep.
So that document is a contract between you and the mortgage company, because the mortgage company has not signed your lease, just you and the landlord. And the landlord can say all they want that your lease will not be terminated if there's a foreclosure, but they can't really hold the mortgage company to that. So this SNDA, once it's signed, says so long as you're not in default under your lease, the mortgage company will not foreclose on you or disturb your lease. It's also filed with the recorder of deeds. So it's out there, everyone can see it, and they know that you have this lease.
Got it. Yeah, that is a tricky one and a devastating one if you end up with that surprise. I don't know how common it is, but I can't imagine that would help anybody on this call.
I, thank goodness, have never seen that happen to anyone. I had a client years ago who told me a horror story where it had actually happened to him.
Yeah.
And he was very careful from then on out to
Oh,
make
I'm
sure that
sure.
he had the SNDA.
I'm sure. Okay, thanks. That's super helpful. So sort of in the spirit of talking about growth, because one of the main, things we try to help with is what are things that can hinder growth? What are things that can help with your growth? And we always talk about that a lot in terms of financing. But what about when it comes to the lease? So if someone is adding additional locations, is there anything you can do on on your leases after you already have established yourself as a business owner, or anything just that you'd want to structure it differently that can work better for them as they add more locations?
Okay, so one of the really good things I advise all the time is to, instead of a personal guarantee when you're going to the second or third or fourth lease,
Mhm.
see if you can get a corporate guarantee instead. So as you probably know, a personal guarantee is where you have an entity that is the tenant. Um, but because you created that entity, you've kind of blocked the landlord from touching your personal assets. All they can go after if you're in default are the assets of the tenant, right? So they have you sign this corporate guarantee and say, we can go around the entity, we can reach your assets if you're in default. Okay. But when you're starting to get quite a few locations, you're going to have a personal guarantee from the franchise agreement. You're going to have one on the lease. You may have one under your loan. Okay. So, it gets a little scary. You're starting to have a lot of personal guarantees and only so much in assets. So if
Mhm.
you have an open location, and it can be a franchise location, or it could be, sometimes I have people that have like a gas station they own it's not a franchise location. But you have a business that's doing well, you can ask the landlord, can we do a corporate guarantee this time instead of a personal guarantee? And that kind of gives me some relief on what's out there against my personal assets. And
Mhm.
you have this really great business that's doing really well, and if the entity doesn't pay the rent, then you can go after this corporate guarantor.
Got it. Yeah, it's not as easy to do when it comes to loans and franchise agreements, but if there is flexibility in the lease anywhere where you can get it, it becomes more and more important as you grow.
That's true, and I don't know about lending, but I know with franchise agreements, you're not gonna get a corporate guarantee, don't try.
Sure.
Gonna be a
Yep.
personal guarantee every time.
Well, just work to get it when you can get it.
Yes.
There's a question that's sort of related to this in the chat. It says how to handle assignability in the event I sell my franchise, seller wants to be off the original lease. Um,
So that is one of the most important terms to negotiate in the entire lease, and a lot of times it's left for very last. Okay. So when I help someone negotiate a lease, typically if there's no term in the LOI that talks about release on assignment, then what we start with is that there's an automatic release if you sell, as long as the landlord has approved the buyer, or it's a franchisee buyer with the same franchise, then you're off the hook. And not just your entity, okay, but also what the most important is the personal guarantors, okay, because that's where you're backing this lease with your home and your other assets. So you really want to be off the hook when you sell. Now, we send the draft back. Most landlords say, no, I'm not going to automatically let you off the hook. So then what we add in is a net worth condition. And we want to look at what does the franchisor require as a minimum net worth for the franchisee. The reason that's important is because most likely you were going to sell to another franchisee. Okay? And you can't look into the future and know, if what the net worth of the average franchisee is going to be in 5, 10, 15 years when you sell the franchise.
Mhm.
So you either go with the number at that time, which is good, because of inflation, that number is always going to rise, or you
Mm.
could say whatever that minimum net worth is at the time that you assign. Um, so a lot of landlords, they want that net worth to be a lot higher. They'll come back and say 10 million when maybe the net worth required by the franchisor is 200,000, something ridiculous. And it does take some time and some negotiating to get that down. But that's very important because you don't want to sell and then still be on the hook for what your buyer does after you leave.
Yeah, thanks. Makes perfect sense. That was a good question. Thank you. Um, can you discuss tenant improvement allowances a little bit and some of your suggestions around those as far as, tips for approaching that part of the lease when it's applicable?
Okay. So first of all, some people are not planning on getting a construction loan and they plan on using that tenant allowance to pay their GC. And if that's the case, start as early as the LOI phase and trying to get the tenant allowance paid in installments. Okay. So you may be able to work with your GC. And, when half the work is completed and you've provided the evidence to the landlord showing that half is completed, then you may be able to get half of the tenant allowance. I've seen installments, 3 installments of tenant allowance, 2, and then of course the most normal is just to get it all after you've opened for business, you've submitted the lien waivers, all of that.
Mhm.
But it can be very helpful if you want to maybe use some of your own money and not get that construction loan to get started, to go ahead and see if you can get it in installments. And a lot of landlords actually will work with you to try to do that.
Got it. And as far as conditions for having it repaid, so how can people make sure that there's no outs for the landlord? How can they make sure that at the end, they get open, it's 30 days post certificate of occupancy, and all of a sudden the landlord says, and you're not getting this money back because of XYZ. How can they protect themselves against that?
So it seems like with the larger landlords, they always seem to pay up. And I think it's because of the tax credit they get for giving the tenant allowance. And they really just want you to be open and everything to work out, right?
Sure.
Some of the smaller landlords out there, like you have some old guy that owns a building.
Mhm.
I have seen in those situations where they come up with a list of all the things the tenant owes them and why they're not going to give the tenant allowance because they're paying themselves back with that. So in that situation, if we know it's a smaller landlord, we want to add into the lease that if they don't pay within the 30 days, then you have the right to deduct the tenant allowance from your rent. Now, the landlord will probably come back and say, well, you can't do the full tenant allowance all at once. So
Mhm.
maybe 50% at a time and only from the base rent or something like that.
Sure. That makes sense. And I think sorry, were you finished? I don't know if I cut you off
I
on.
was finished. You're okay.
Sometimes I get ahead of myself. Um, because I wanted to talk about how that impacts your lending too, which is important for people. Like you framed it perfectly, where if you're not getting a construction loan, then you're not beholden to any financing requirements when it comes to how the tenant allowance is taken into consideration. So that's a great way of negotiating that in there if you're self-funding or anything like that. If you are getting a loan, it's important to know, like, if they're going to do it in installments and that works for you, that's great, but you want to be upfront with your lender about how that is being repaid. Obviously the lender is going to see that in the lease, but you might get to a point where you're getting approved before you have the lease. And so those are things to think about, so that it doesn't negatively impact your financing, right? Um, especially in what you just mentioned, where you might have some smaller landlords try to negotiate like the rent in lieu, or say, oh, we'll spread it out, we'll just give you free rent for a period of time, and sort of go back on paying that lump sum. That can be problematic if you've structured your loan in a way where the lender is financing the TI. So if the lender is sort of fronting that money and you've already closed your loan, that's going to be problematic for you with a lot of banks. So it's just sort of knowing those things ahead of time can really help uh, when you're in the negotiation phase.
That's actually news to me. No one has told me that before, so I'm glad to know that. Because
Yeah,
now every time I have a lease where the tenant allowances and installments, I'm gonna warn them, you talk to your lender. You need to let your lender know now.
yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, I think SBA lenders, it can vary a lot between banks. And then, speaking for ApplePie, I know that is one of the things that if we're financing it, we don't allow it to be paid in installments. It has to be a lump sum. Doesn't mean you can't get a loan through ApplePie if it is set up that way. It just means we would structure the loan differently. So as long as we know it ahead of time, we'll make sure everything works. But we just don't want to have to go back after the fact and change things up because it could have unintended consequences. That's all.
There
Uh,
were two other points I wanted to touch on with
oh,
tenant
sure.
allowance. Is that okay?
Of course. Yep.
Okay, so, what if the landlord wants to do a rent credit in lieu of the tenant allowance?
Hmm.
Um, that's okay. Just keep in mind there's possible tax implications. So most landlords won't want to do that, because they're getting a tax break for giving you the tenant allowance. Um, but if you do get that rent credit instead, just, let your CPA know, because I'm not sure how that's going to work out. Now, I've never had anybody come back to me that did get a rent credit for their tenant allowance and say, "Oh, I had a huge tax on that." So maybe it's okay. That's a CPA question.
Perfect. Good to know. Did you say you had one more point on that, Yvonne, or was that it on the TIs?
Oh, there was one more. And this actually came up with a client in the last year or two. So, this client had a GC that wanted to make a change in the build out, and said, this will save you some money, and it's not necessary that we do this 100% according to the plans that the landlord has approved, right? And the client didn't know any better and said yes. Okay. The problem came later when the landlord found out and said, the lease says that in order to get your tenant allowance, you have to build out the space according to the plans that we approved. And you did not build it out according to those plans. Something was changed.
Hmm.
Now it worked out for that client, thank goodness.
Mm.
But that is one of those oh my goodness moments, right? What
Oh
you
gosh.
don't want to happen to you. So make sure you do a real change order. And I think in that case the GC was real young and new at it and didn't know any better. But make sure you do the change order and get the landlord's approval if you change anything in that build out after the landlord has approved your plans.
Yeah. Great point, especially with how often that happens. Um, okay. So aside from we talked about TI allowances, we talked about sort of CAM and other surprises you want to avoid. Um, what are some other things you consistently try to get into the lease that maybe we haven't covered already?
Okay, so the first one you'll be familiar with is that landlord subordination agreement that lenders give to a landlord. And lenders need that before the loan closing. So they typically won't close without it.
Mhm.
Maybe they always won't close without it.
Mhm.
Um, so what that agreement says is that if the tenant defaults under the loan, that the lender gets first dibs to all the stuff in the premises, all that physical property. So they
Mhm.
can take it and sell it and pay themselves back a little bit. Okay. Landlords don't like it because under the lease and sometimes under state statutes, they also have the security interest in the stuff in your premises. So the problem can arise when a landlord feels that they don't have to sign that agreement and just refuse to sign it. And I
Mhm.
had it one time happen. It's happened a few times, but one time a client was closing their loan on the eve of closing their loan, and the lender said, "We need the landlord to sign this," and the landlord said, "No." Um, So it's good to put language in the lease that says landlord agrees to sign a reasonable subordination agreement. And that way, if they refuse to sign it, you can say, okay, well, what's not reasonable in there, and negotiate with them and work that out so that you're not, your GC standing in the wings waiting and you're wasting days on your build out because this agreement isn't signed yet.
Yeah, absolutely. That never happens. That's a good one. What about effective dates as it relates to permits and things like that? How do you handle that type of thing?
Okay, so first with your plans, getting your plans done. Um, a lot of leases, when I get them, will say you have 30 days after the effective date. And the effective date is when you've signed and then the landlord signs. The date that the landlord signs, because they sign second, is the effective date.
Hmm.
So you have 30 days from that date to submit your plans to the landlord for approval. Well, most architects will take between 45 and 60 days to get plans done. And a lot of people don't want to hire their architect before the lease is signed because what if something falls through last minute,
Hmm.
right? So I like to get 60 days from effective date in all the leases. Sometimes we have to go with 45. If we ever have to go with 30, you are hiring the architect before the lease is signed.
Got it. There's a lot of chicken and egg scenarios when it comes to lease negotiation.
Yeah.
What about rent commencement?
Okay, so first off, before you sign the lease and you settle on, the rent commencement date, you may have agreed in the LOI to say, okay, rent commencement is 180 days after I sign the lease. Okay. But you want to try to get some different language in there, even though maybe you agreed to that in the LOI. First off, you want to call the township or city and find out how long they typically take to get the permits back to you after your GC or architect has submitted those plans to them. So everything's good in the application. What does it normally take? Like in Florida and California, certain areas, it can take 2 months or more. There's other places in the country it takes 2 weeks. So
Mhm.
it's good to know ahead of time how long that's going to take. If you have 180 days to open for business and pay your rent, and your build out takes 5 months, if it takes 2 months to get your plans and then another 2 months to get your permits, you're going to be paying rent before you open, and nobody wants that. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
So um once you know how long it's going to take to get permits, then you're going to work with that definition of when rent commences. um the optimal situation in any lease is to say, let's say you have a 5 6 month build out, like for a My Salon Suite, right?
mhm.
180 days. So give yourself a little extra time if it's a 5 months, okay? Because things are going to happen that you haven't planned for. 180 days from the later of landlord giving you possession of the space, handing you the keys, or you receiving all the permits you need for that build out. That way you're not eating up your build out time with getting permits.
Yeah, that's the wild card for sure.
Definitely.
What about site surveys? Would you suggest getting those and when? Like how do you approach that?
So I suggest to everyone that they get the site survey as soon as possible. Now that should not stop you from, sending the lease draft back and forth to the landlord's attorney. We just tell them in the first draft that the tenant is getting a site survey, and the square footage might be different than what the lease says, and some things could pop up, some really major things that nobody expected, but probably not. You don't want to scare them, right?
Sure.
So you just let them know it's happening. And then I say every single time, because the few times I've had clients not get a site survey before the lease is signed, after the lease is signed, they go and get it, and then they find out there's something major wrong. And how do you have any leverage with the landlord? If it's something major, you didn't think this was part of the deal. You don't have money in your budget to fix this.
Yeah.
So the landlord may say, lease is signed. I'm not changing anything. And then that's on you. You're stuck with that expense.
Yeah, definitely not something you'd want to avoid. Um, oh, so all the things that you're supposed to do. We've got permits, rent commencement. What about opening deadlines? Is there anything in that that can be important to negotiate?
So technically, if your lease says you have to be open, a lot of times it will say by the rent commencement date.
Hmm.
Um, I try to get another 30 or 60 days just in case something has happened and you can't open on time. That way, it's not a default under the lease if you don't open by the rent commencement date. It's not the hugest issue in the world, but your tenant allowance language probably says you can't be in default to get your tenant allowance. So if you're trying to get installments, then that could cause a problem.
Understood. Okay, that makes sense. Um, Anything else we didn't cover on uh things to get into the lease that uh just things that important bullet points. I feel like we've covered a lot, but is there anything we missed?
Just really quickly, accelerated rent clauses is something I wanted to talk about because almost every single lease has them.
Mhm.
And what that means is that if you've defaulted and the lease has been terminated or you've been kicked out of possession, the
Mhm.
landlord's going to go against you for the rent for the rest of your current term. So, most people have a 10-year term for a franchise location, that initial term. They can go after the rent for the rest of that term. If you're in year one, that's almost 10 years of rent, right? Or in a renewal term, they can go after the rent for the rest of the renewal term. In some states, they're actually illegal. The state legislatures have said this is not fair to ask somebody to pay all this rent in one lump sum. Because what happens? At that point, if you've defaulted, it's probably because your entity has no money. So who pays that? The personal guarantors. Then your house maybe is on the line if you're not in a state that protects your house. A lot of
Mhm.
states will have a little bit of a homestead exemption, but if you look in a lot of them, it's maybe 40, $50,000 of the value of your house is protected, and that's it. So if the landlord goes after you for accelerated rent under the guarantee, you're gonna have to sell your house. So one of the things, if you have a landlord that's just really pushing back and saying, I'm not going to give up the accelerated rent clause, I like to go back and say, well, can we make it a little bit easier, a little bit more fair for the tenant, for the personal guarantor? Could we reduce it to 6 months of rent at a time or 12 months of rent at a time? And that way it's more doable. So you probably wouldn't lose your house, hopefully not. And you can work it out.
Got it. That's a huge one. Obviously, no one wants to talk about default scenarios. It's not the most fun topic when you're opening a business, but it's just important to understand what can happen in a worst case scenario, obviously. Um, we talked about this a little bit earlier on when it comes to selling, but I imagine is there like, as when it comes to getting the entity and PGs released on assignment, is that something else that, I mean, I guess you kind of touched on it earlier, but do you want to elaborate on that in terms of a default scenario?
Okay. So do you mean kind of in connection with your own default?
Yes, correct.
So I think probably what you mean is you can negotiate with the landlord to get a limitation on the personal guarantee.
Right.
So, what's pretty typical for a 10-year initial term is that as long as you've not had a default beyond a notice and cure period within the first 10 years of the lease,
Mhm.
then you will be released from that guarantee after the first 5 years. Now, sometimes we have a rolling amount of time that's added on after that. It could be like another year rolling for the rest of the 10 years. So you would have to come up with 1 year of rent, which is so much better than 5 years of rent.
Yeah.
Sometimes, the 1 year rolling can go into the renewals. We always try to prevent that, but sometimes it just has to happen in order to get the deal done. And there
Sure.
are people that negotiate, sometimes it's already negotiated in the LOI, that maybe they have a 2 year guarantee and then it burns off. So it's a
Got
lot of
it.
options out there. It's really important again at the LOI stage to try to get that worked out if you can, because it's harder to negotiate it later. If if the LOI says you're going to be a personal guarantor for 10 years and then 2 5-year options, it's really
Mhm.
hard to get that changed.
Makes sense. Um, all right. I feel like we've covered a lot with leases. I was going to go move on to entity formation really quick, but I just want to
Sure.
make sure was there anything else that we missed? I know you had a lot to talk about.
We got it all.
Okay, perfect. We're doing great then. Um, there's not a ton to say on this, but I just wanted to pick your brain on entity structures that you see multi-unit franchisees using when it comes to people that have a lot of locations. Are there pros and cons to one over the other?
So you could choose to have a different entity for each location, which I would recommend. And then sometimes franchisees want a parent entity that owns all those entities. A lot of times they're LLCs. But my advice is go to your accountant or CPA because they are going to give you tax advice on what's best for you to form. Okay. I am always going to say to you, any attorney will say to you, don't put all of your businesses under one entity because then if somebody sues you for something that happened at one location, they can reach all the assets for all the entities because it's all in one. Okay. So dividing it up will help you not be liable for something that happens at one location with the assets of all your other locations.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think it's hard. It can be challenging lending wise too. If everything's all under one, it's definitely doable. And a lot of people um, do it that way for various reasons, but it simplifies things when you're trying to sell or when you're trying to just leverage one location over another. So it's important for both, like sort of protecting the liability and also making it a little bit easier to grow when you're opening more than one location at a time or throughout the course of your franchise journey. The other thing you help with is sort of reviewing and understanding franchise agreements. So I know you do that for a lot of your clients.
Mhm.
Uh, obviously, there's stuff. Most of the stuff in there is sort of boilerplate. But what are some typical terms that franchisees either don't understand or have concerns about, and how do you what do you discuss the most when it comes to helping people understand those better?
Okay, well, the first thing, if you're a first time franchisee, most people don't understand that you can't really negotiate a franchise agreement.
Mhm.
So the work that I do is really educating you on what's in there, what's typical and what's not typical. And it seems like all the agreements out there have been written by, there's not that many franchise attorneys that do franchisor work. So you see them again and again. You see the same form and people reuse the form and maybe add something. So when I do this review, I'm not searching for changes to be made, but I will tell you this is normal. This is normal. Oh, this is not normal. Do you want to go back and ask about this?
Right.
If you have an established franchisor that's been doing things for years, they don't want to make changes to their agreement because they did that at the beginning. They know what works now. So they're going to tell you take it or leave it. And then part of my job is to let you know, okay, this is normal. And a lot of people sign this every day, but here's what it means. And if you don't like it, then you don't have to sign it. Um, so so that's what it is. Um, when I do a review, I go through and there's always questions. And a lot of times the nicest way to present a concern to a franchisor is to ask a question. Okay. So when we're done the review, I'm taking notes the whole time. And then I send a bullet point list of questions for the franchisee to take back to the franchisor.
Makes sense. And I would imagine most franchisors are eager to answer those and get things worked out quickly.
Yes. Yes. And most of them give very clear answers. And, the client will bring me back the answers and say, what do you think about this? And I'll be like, oh, okay.
Sure. Makes sense. Um, anything else that people get confused on that you end up having to point out or that people get stuck on?
So a lot of franchisees are not aware that they're signing a personal guarantee. I do more leases than I do franchise reviews.
Mm.
So, you know, somebody's come to me, they've already signed the franchise agreement. And when we go through the personal guarantee in the lease, I'll say, well, you signed one for your franchise agreement. And they say, I did. They aren't aware of that. So just be aware, you know, that there is one in there. Sometimes it's in an exhibit, an addendum. It's just like a little blurb or two, but if you've signed a franchise agreement since 2008 or so, you have signed a personal guarantee. And it is in effect for that full initial term and for all the renewal terms. That's something you're not going to be able to get rid of. So it's there.
Got it. Makes perfect sense. Um, okay. We've covered a lot and gotten into the weeds on a lot of things that we don't normally. Is there anything else that we missed that you can think of? I feel like we covered most of the ground, but in
I
case
don't
I
believe
missed.
so.
Okay. There's a question in the chat, says, do you see franchisors rolling over existing franchise agreements to new buyers, or do they always require a new franchise agreement to be signed?
So just like a renewal page, I guess is what they mean, instead of signing a whole new franchise agreement. Typically, it's the whole new agreement, and your
Yeah.
franchise agreement will say it's going to be whatever the current agreement is. Now, when I've represented buyers, I have gone when I get the chance to, I have gone back and looked at the old franchise agreement that the seller had and say,
Mhm.
hey, these terms are better, and tried to get some of those better terms. So sometimes it's just not possible.
Got it. Probably just depends a lot on the brand and how long the original franchisee has been with them, possibly.
So you don't pay an initial franchise fee when you're buying an existing location, and most franchisors will give you another full initial term, which is nice. So
Yeah.
you're going to get another 10 years without paying that initial franchise fee. Of course, you have this big purchase price to pay, but yeah.
Makes sense. Um, There was another one in the chat earlier on that was related to the tenant improvement allowance. I think it says you can get your landlord to pay the GC directly in installments to up to a set amount, and then you can cover the difference at the end. That's worked well for this person. Have you seen that? Have you ever negotiated it that way, or is that common?
So I don't negotiate the agreements with the GC, but if someone was able to do that, that's fantastic.
Got it. Wonderful. Just trying to make sure I've gotten, there's kind of a lot of activity here, so I want to make sure I get all the questions before we wrap things up. For the people in the chat, there are some questions I'll answer offline that I think are just more specific to lending, so I can answer those offline. But just I don't want you to feel like you're being ignored. So anyone who's asking some of those questions, I'll answer those separately. Um, I think we've covered everything that we wanted to when it comes to leases, entity formation, and then just general franchise agreement questions. For anybody who had to drop early or maybe didn't join, we, like I said in the beginning, we'll send this recording out usually tomorrow, but if not by the weekend, this will be something that we send out. And we do these usually quarterly. We may do another one by the end of the year, potentially, but if not, look for one maybe in January. And we're very grateful for everybody joining us. Yvonne, you've been excellent.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
being our first non-franchisee panelist. I think it worked very well for us. And then obviously here's some general information on the screen for financing and just for general questions. So if you think of a question after this that you wanted to ask, you can always send it into that email is probably the best place. I don't know if I would recommend calling the number to answer any questions related to this, but you can always send it to loans@ApplePie Capital. So thank you so much, everyone. We'll wrap about 9 minutes early, which is perfect. Give you some time back in your day. And thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Bye,
Take care,
everybody.
guys.